Okay, I think let's begin. And on behalf of the Circular Buildings Coalition, I'd like to say a very great welcome to all of you for this afternoon webinar for the next hour. And today we discuss one of the very important questions relating to circularity, and that is how we make circularity great, not only for the planet, but also for the people, and in particular also the workforce. How can we use circularity also as a mean of creating decent jobs, high quality jobs is the issue we're looking into today. And together with Hannah from Smith Innovation, we have the honor of hosting this event today. And the topic is just transition, and what you're going to meet today is next one please, Hannah. We're discussing this main topic, which is obviously of utmost importance in order to make circularity happen in a positive way. And next please. You're gonna have presentations by the three persons you're seeing here, or at least presentation and reflections. So today's seminar is based on a report made by the Circular Buildings Coalition, more precisely made by Esther and Circular Economy. So Esther will take us through main findings of this report and also some recommendations to the end. And then we'll have perspective from two key players within the field, Ellen Heurenbosch and Giulio Ferrini, I was instructed to say, and they will give their kind of view to this topic after the main presentation from Esther. And then afterwards, heading for the program, we will also have time for discussion and questions from all of you. And I should say that this thing will be recorded. We have quite a few people who couldn't be able to make it for this exact time, but who will look into it later. So it will be recorded. And also in practical terms, if you have any questions, please put them forward in the Q&A, and then we'll take them whenever appropriate. So this is the overall agenda for today. But before we start, I would just like to add a few words on the CPC, which is hosting this event. Smith Innovation, we have had the honor of kind of facilitating this coalition for the last 2 years. And the overall aim of the coalition is to obviously put circularity on the agenda and be a shared and trusted voice, which some of the leading organizations going together and set targets, identify baselines, but also giving support to specific solutions that could make a very squared industry a bit less squared. So we try to create a common language, skills and knowledge around circularity. We try to work not only on the technology push, but also on the demand side, that there's an interest and also investments in circularity. And we try to be kind of a forum where you can work across different interests and different fields of practices in order to make more holistic approaches to circularity. And all, of course, with the purpose of promote and develop the uptake of circular and scalable solutions. And we work in two main ways. One is that we have been doing reports, kind of identifying where we are and need to go. And we've been doing overall reports like the 4 pathway reports published last year. And then we also felt the need to look into issues that are much more deep dive, but are really important. And one of them is a just transition theme, which we will explore today. We have had 2 other also events like this, looking into assurance and also into concrete specific material, and you'll find these webinars recorded on our homepage. But today we're going to talk about the just transition aspect. So one thing is that we are doing these overall system view reports, you might say, and then secondly, we're also trying to support bottom-up initiatives that can demonstrate success and also perhaps demystify assumed barriers to circularity. And we have had 2 rounds of direct support to organizations and companies making these solutions. And what you see here is the 6 selected winners of the last cohort of blueprint projects. Yeah, so they're now in the process of maturing their solutions, and as a part of this, also looking into how to make jobs in a positive way, you might say. So this is very briefly about what we do in CBC, and enough on that, I think, because now we're eager to go on with the main topic, and that is the findings from the deep dive we had on circularity and just transition. So Esther, please take us through the report and some of the quite interesting findings you made.
Pleasure. Thank you, Mikael, and great to see those of you online, and also a big hello to those watching the recording a little later on. Yeah, it's my pleasure to share a summary of the paper that we produced at the beginning of this year with you all, and maybe a little bit of background on our organisation and the programme that I lead at Circular Economy, because we have worked a lot on the construction sector, given of its relevance to climate and circularity targets, as I'll touch on in a moment. But the Circular Jobs Initiative, which I lead at Circular Economy, is about looking across sectors at how the circular economy can be positive for work and workers. So looking at the nuts and bolts, the skills, the training, the specific roles and occupations that we need to implement circular strategies, but also the impact of implementing circular strategies in local and global supply chains. So I'm very pleased to have Ellen and Julio on the call so that we can have a really rich discussion about, as Mikael said, this very important topic of how to make the transition to circularity just. If we go on to the next slide. Yeah, I thought it'd be helpful to kick off with a few key questions that we tried to address with this deep dive report. So we wanted to demonstrate and spell out why a just transition is essential for the EU circular economy construction ambitions, particularly for industry stakeholders or those working on the more technical parts of the circular economy that might not be so used to thinking about this through the lens of labour market transitions. We wanted to look at what the barriers are that currently stand in the way, but also the best practices that can inspire action. And we wanted to end with practical recommendations that different stakeholders can use to design policies and initiatives that are just and inclusive to transform the industry. Next slide, please. And a bit of background, which is also included in the report. So I think the construction industry is a very interesting one and a very important one to be addressing the just transition within, because it really stands at the centre stage of multiple transitions happening, and within the European Union sustainability transition. So both in terms of environmental and social sustainability. We know it's key for operationalising the energy transition, providing buildings and infrastructure that are fit for the future. It's also very important in terms of other areas of the just transition, in terms of tackling inequalities, providing basic needs in terms of housing and places where businesses can thrive. And it's a major employer. So these are 2020 statistics of 11 million people employed in direct construction and 3.5 million companies, lots of these SMEs with a vast supply chains and subcontracting chains, as we'll touch on, I'm sure, later. Next slide, please. And circularity is being embraced as a really important opportunity to achieve climate targets through this industry. And as Mikael referenced, the Circular Buildings Coalition produced a report last year that looks at the potential of different circular solutions to reduce material and carbon footprints for the industry. Next slide, please. But I think one of the key messages that I'd like to bring home today is that introducing anything new into an industry, and that goes for circular economy practices, and maybe even more for circular economy practices because of their technical nature and the new materials they introduce brings about changes that need to be managed. And whenever changes are brought into the labour market, these need to be thought through, and multiple stakeholders need to be engaged to ensure that the managed process is staged and supports workers along the process. So this change comes about in several ways. So through new regulations and targets and guidance that need to be set at the EU level, member states and cities and industry actors and social partners need to then work on the implementation of. There are new circular economy related services, products and insurance models, particularly in the construction industry, that come into the market and also change the way that stakeholders work together. And as we'll touch on, hopefully a lot in this hour, there will be need for new roles, but also differentiation in current roles, different sorts of skills or mixes of skills, training, and importantly, safety and health standards and regulations that workers and employers will need to adjust to. And so what we tried to do with this report was to paint this big picture, but also zoom in to make it tangible and to give examples of what this managed change could look like for two construction pathways, which were in the original report produced by the CBC last year. And we selected two strategies that were anticipated to have large employment impacts. So one is building with the right materials. So essentially reuse of materials and recycling into new construction projects or renovation projects. So reducing the use of virgin and carbon intensive materials. And then the build nothing pathway, which is about promoting renovation, retrofit and adaptive use of existing buildings. So extending the lifespan of existing building stock. Next slide, please. So a high-level snapshot, and there's much more detail in the report in terms of specific roles and how they will shift. But for the building with the right materials, we saw through research and consultation with industry stakeholders that the main labour impacts, and I will say in the report we looked at what the scenario would be if these strategies were really introduced at scale, what would be needed to scale up these strategies. So those main impacts would be felt off-site largely, so in the material procurement, assessment, quality assurance and tracking. And due to the labour intensity of material management and recycling processes, we also saw that there'd be an increased demand for labour at multiple stages. So the main changes in roles, services and business models off-site, but an increased labour demand across the board. And we've highlighted here a couple of key roles where skilled labour will become particularly vital. Next slide, please. And then for build nothing, we see there are multiple scenarios and directions that the value chain can take depending on whether repair, retrofitting, or other strategies are prioritised. And here, consultation with experts revealed that the main impacts would be felt on-site. So the main changes will be to the day-to-day tasks that on-site workers, assessors and evaluators would be needing to do, working on-site to retrofit, renovate, and conduct repairs of existing buildings, and that this will require a very tailored approach because depending on the age of the building stock, a range of factors, there'll be many things that need to be adjusted and then tailored. And this will often need to be, again, determined on site. And this is also a key strategy that will need, as with all circular strategies, to be integrated within current energy efficiency initiatives that are already working on the retrofit and installation and other energy efficiency strategies for current buildings. And that this is really where there is a challenge in terms of the large-scale upskilling that would be needed to meet the technical demands, to close skills gaps that are currently there. But there's also a challenge in terms of a tailored approach and achieving this at scale, and providing the enough scale that vet providers nationally and locally and industry can roll out the required training. Next slide, please. In the report, you'll also find several case studies that we went and looked for that provide ideas around best practices, but also identify some of the barriers that are faced in the industry, and several key projects that are trying to promote circular solutions in the construction industry related to those two pathways, but also have an element of this project or initiative that is focused on job creation or skills development. So on the left, you see an example from Austria, where they really took an approach working with work integration social enterprises, so social enterprises that are specifically geared towards supporting the transition of workers out of work into work and creating particular opportunities for disadvantaged groups. And this was a very nice example because it took this inclusive approach first, really leading with this set of partners that needed to ensure those roles and opportunities and placements were shaped in such a way, but also working on the technical ordnance and certifications needed for this reuse strategy. And there's also, at the time of writing, some very nice impacts in terms of the number of employment hours and the revenue that was being generated by sales that was being cycled back, when we talk about circularity, into funding more training and education programs like this, and the establishment of a worker cooperative for those that went on to work through the project. We also found an example of a project, a European Commission funded project being delivered in 3 countries that was focusing on renovation or different strategies under the Build Nothing pathway for different sorts of building stock. So it was both trying to maximize performance and quality, but also create job opportunities. So here we see interesting regional differentiation also in terms of the needs of the housing market or the building sector within each of these countries. So renovation of rural architecture in Bologna in Italy. In Estonia, it was focusing on residential buildings, and in Slovenia on single family households. Next slide, please. Great. And I just have a couple more slides here, which I hope will also spark some of the discussion we'll have today, is towards the barriers that currently stand in the way of a just transition for the construction industry when circular strategies are introduced. So the first is industry fragmentation. I won't go into this one in too much detail because I know our colleague Ellen will dive into this in further depth, but those of you working within the industry with knowledge of how it operates will know that workers are predominantly posted through very long subcontracting chains. There's a large amount of cross-border movement of these posted workers, and this results in a general lack of transparency about who is working on site, what sort of training they have, and this reduces the opportunity to provide protection to workers, which is incredibly important in these situations where occupational safety and health are high priority. There's also a barrier which is quite common when you look at circular economy business models across industries around real and perceived costs and risks of circular practices. So we know that by and large the financial system, investment models that are used and insurance models have been based on a linear way of doing business and producing products. And these often currently unfavorably favor business models that are based on raw material use and don't actually internalize some of the supply chain risks that come from reliance on raw materials, for example. And so unfairly penalize circular economy business models where there's less known about use of secondary materials, for example. Another key challenge, which also relates to the fourth, is weak policy signals. So unlike the energy efficiency wave within the construction industry, where there's been very clear targets set at the EU level, which are now being implemented by member states, there is generally a lack of binding targets for circular economy, which then limits the ability to transform the labour market in a targeted way, and also sort of bolsters some of the perceived risks and costs, because there isn't a clear direction for industry to move towards when it comes to circular practices. And that counts for to what degree employers will invest in training for their workforce, for example. Which takes me on to the last. So skills, gaps and training infrastructure. So as I've lightly touched on, many of the circular strategies will require new skills, updated training, both in terms of the technical side, but also occupational safety and health. Increased communication on sites is very much a different way of doing things in many cases. And this requires direction at the EU level, which member states can implement through programs that address skills gaps in a targeted way and address these fears of costs and the industry fragmentation that we currently see. Next slide, please. And so I'll just briefly touch on these because we'll go into the discussion, and I'll also close the session providing a bit more detail on these recommendations. But these are the 3 sets of recommendations that you can find in the report, where we firstly prioritise the integration of social standards into EU-wide circular standards and guidelines, so to the barrier around weak policy signals, making sure there's a clear signal, but those signals also integrate social standards. As with any transition, sectoral social dialogue is essential for just transition planning. So we outline recommendations, particularly the role of social partners to work with other stakeholders to ensure that the process is managed and is just. And as part of this, looking at the provision and investment in skills and occupational safety and health, which can be also integrated into tripartite agreements and the dialogues between social partners that need to be taking place with industry stakeholders. So it's a very quick summary of a report that I hope you'll all dive into in more detail, and happy to take questions as part of the panel and to follow up with those interested in just transition for construction, but also more widely related to circularity. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Esther. And I think it's quite interesting that you can't talk about the consequences of circularity in just one way. It will depend very much on the specific pathways you're following. So we really need to talk about it in a more nuanced way. The potential and pitfalls are quite different, whether we use the build nothing new or new materials or circular materials strategy, for instance. Yeah, so this was the general overview, and now turning next to a workforce perspective, and Ellen Heurenbosch, wasn't probably quite right. Anyway, you have also been working with this quite a while, so let's hear your thoughts on this topic.
Well, thank you so much, and Esther also for sharing this really nice report. And we've cooperated quite well for quite some time now. It's not the first time. We've known each other for a few years now. And I'm very happy with the cooperation. And I'm also happy that, of course, you and your organization took the workers' perspective, because in the debate on circular economy and just transition, energy transition, it has been quite a technical discussion so far. And well, we fear that the workers' perspective is often not a priority, but well, especially on a topic like circular economy, we say from the workers' perspective, it's a clear prerequisite to create sustainable jobs and to have really qualified workers on board to be able to go through such a process to circular economy. But we face some difficulties indeed. So next slide then, please, to start off. Well, my name is indeed Ellen Hoeyenbos, and I'm so happy you pronounce it quite well. Thank you, Mikkel, for that. I work for the Dutch Trade Union, FNV, and on the EU level, I work with the European Federation of Building and Woodworkers. We see the logo next to me in the name, and we have a beautiful campaign currently related to subcontracting. But on EU level, EU has created 14 industrial ecosystem already quite some time ago. And well, construction is the building of residential and non-residential estates. It's building of roads and railways, building of utilities and civil engineering and associated activities. So in short, there's a broad range of activities that we can consider a construction activity. Well, next slide then, please. Some of the characteristics, I saw that Esther and I have the same source. Indeed, the construction sector is one of the largest sector in EU. And there we have it, 3.5 million companies employing around 11 million persons. So that's quite a lot. But the average numbers of persons employed per enterprise is 3.1. So we see a lot of small companies, and that is something that, of course, we all know. In 2021, 11.1% of the EU 27 GDP was created in the construction sector. So that is considerably. And the total turnover in the sector amounted to 1,750 billion euros in 2020. But, and there it is, the payment to subcontractors is about 23.5% of total turnover. And in the building sector, it's even 36.6%. So indeed, we have this characteristic of the construction sector where large companies function as the main contractor. And then we have a lot of SMEs involved, and they assume the role of subcontractors. So next slide. And then we are faced with a variety of issues. We see then long chains of subcontracting, which leads to a very intransparent construction site. We have many activities. We have many people at a certain place at a certain time. Also, transnationalization is a big issue. Esther mentioned it already. We have workers coming from everywhere from Europe to a certain site, but also nowadays coming from beyond the European Union. And the role of temporary employment agencies in the subcontracting chain is a big issue. Research has shown that, also research from EU level, where well, there's a big debate on the role of temporary agencies in this subcontracting chain. Why do companies subcontract? Because there is also a price competition, huge price competition, and that is a problem. That's in the discussion on how can we solve all the issues. We are not going to solve all at once, so that's a disclaimer. But price competition is huge, and that is something, of course, that we need to take into consideration when we talk about solutions. But the effect on subcontracting is that we face a lot of enforcement difficulties because the responsibility is often passed on to the next linked in the chain. And that is from enforcement bodies' perspective. But imagine if you're a worker and you're working in the 15th layer of subcontracting, you face some difficulties and you want to confront somebody. But who are you going to confront? People sometimes do not even know who their employer or maybe their client is. This leads to this fragmented sector, and it's the opposite of what we really want, a sustainable sector. But with the EFBWW, we have given it a lot of thoughts over many years. And yes, we have a strategy. And next slide. So we have this campaign on EU level, what we say, we have to limit the subcontracting chain. This is currently a hot topic, but I think we can agree. We are working with that on that topic also with the employers, the FIAC on EU level. It's also not a quick fix, but I think we can see that we all want to have a manageable construction site, and we want it to be transparent. We also have something with temporary agencies. I'm not going to dive into that. And of course, proper collective bargaining rules that is in place. But what I would like to address today is, of course, what we have been doing together with the FIAC on EU level is this project on social ID cards. Social ID cards is a tool where, we want to create visibility. We want to create transparency on a construction site. And for the on the side of the employers, of course, because they need to know who is working for who on their side, and also for our side, from the worker's perspective, we want to strengthen the position of the worker. And indeed, if there is an issue, that he does know where he can go to address his complaint or whatever. From a more broader perspective, and that is in the context of circular economy and the really important topic on skills. If you talk about social ID cards, we can have a lot of objectives, but I think one of the most important objectives here is that you can link it also with the people's skills and people's education and what they have been doing in the past, and that they have a proper tool for themselves and that they can access their data, so that they can always say, this is my experience, so they are less vulnerable for abusive situations, that they're only put on a certain spot to do easy jobs and have little money to earn. But transparency on VET and on skills is quite important. I've put in a link to the Sidekick mapping that we have been doing with the FIEC, and Sidekick stands for Social ID Cards in Construction. And we made a mapping because many countries already have a system in place, but we need to have many more countries involved. And I come from the Netherlands originally, and we have a huge debate. We have a vision, we know where we want to go, but it's also not implemented yet in the Netherlands. But it is a tool that we all say as construction social partners that it is a very necessary tool for the future. I've also put here a responsible procurement. I think maybe in the debate later we can talk about a bit on that, but maybe not for now. Let's focus on the social ID card as a tool. Next slide, please. Okay, and then the other slide, afterwards even, and that's a quote, well, I've used for quite some time now. Initially, when I first met the Circle Economy, so the company from Esther, and then there was a quote that circular economy can boost decent jobs, etc. And then I said, no, you need to have decent jobs in order to boost circularity. So what comes first? I think it goes hand in hand. But I think it's a quite nice quote to keep in mind. We need each other. So that was my presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ellen. And I think it's quite interesting that you point to the issue of fragmentation, because that is really a characteristic of construction, and it's a thing that we really deal with and struggle with, even if the matter is decent jobs, or whether it's keeping track of materials and make circularity work on the material side, or perhaps even also an innovation side, as we work with here in Smith Innovation. So I think it is quite interesting that fragmentation and how to deal with that is something that we share, even though the purpose might be manifold. So thanks a lot for pointing that out. And now I'd like to hand over the floor to our last speaker, Giulio, which will share some of your insights. And as I think you will not have any slides, I think we'll just stop sharing a bit and then we can see your face better. So please, Giulio, if the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, thanks, Mikkel, and thanks everyone else for joining today. So yeah, great to have this webinar. I think when we were preparing it, I highlighted how relevant it was to have a webinar to draw attention to this report. I think there are so many reports out there, but this is generally one of those that I keep bookmarked, and near the top of my bookmark list, because it's one that I think often comes up in conversation with other partners, and I think is really very relevant, particularly the conversation around the pathways regarding building nothing. It feels like there's a lot of kind of current interest in this approach of framing sufficiency and circularity. My name is Giulio. I lead the Built Environment Program at the Institute for Human Rights and Business. It's also known as IHRB. We're a not-for-profit global think tank that works with civil society organizations, with policymakers and front-running businesses to make human rights, including labor rights, part of everyday business. And over the last 4 or 5 years, we've been doing lots of work on a just transition in the built environment. We've done research across 8 global cities. And I think my role here today is kind of reflect a little bit more broadly on the global kind of macro picture within which circularity sits. We published our report 15 months ago, and it's quite staggering to think about just how much has changed particularly in the political, but also in the economic context that we operate within. Obviously, one key shift that we've seen is around a centering of kind of productivity increase, job creation, and growth as really the framing that is driving a lot of government action globally. And I think this report really does a great job of picking that up in terms of framing the potential upsides of this approach in a language that I think resonates with a lot of policymakers. The other area where I think there's been a big shift is around global trade. And I think while we were doing our research, there was kind of emerging rumors of terminology like global decoupling. And I think since then, obviously, a certain election has happened. And I think it's fair to say that we're in kind of full-blown protectionist era. And the most obvious instances of this are obviously the tariffs introduced by the United States of America. But even in Europe, we're now seeing announcements of quotas on steel imports, and also the implementations of programs that have been in the works for quite a long time, such as the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is effectively a tariff, but a kind of environmentally aligned one that definitely predates the elections. And I think it's interesting to reflect, how does circularity fall within this or alongside this? And I think there are definitely some potential upsides for circularity from a kind of protectionist, isolationist perspectives. I will also touch on the downsides, don't worry, but I'll start with the upsides. And I think I've heard so many businesses talking about supply chain resilience, the risk and unknowns of kind of global supply chains, and therefore focusing more on localized materials, the reuse of materials, which I think obviously has great upsides from a kind of climate emissions perspective and circularity. However, I think it is important to kind of remind ourselves of kind of where this all starts, and the kind of global dimension, and the fact that obviously climate change is a global challenge and will require a global solution. I think it's been really exciting to see the narrative around just transition emerging in the kind of political, but also in the company lingo, and this kind of recognition that we cannot afford to leave anyone behind. But I think there's often a misunderstanding of who no one is. And we've definitely seen a kind of a lot of focus on local workers, in-country workers, again, framed within this kind of protectionist mindset. And I think this is understandable. I think as a colleague once put it, we realized that we're asking a lot of people to think about the end of the world when they could only really think about the end of the week. And it's understandable that therefore this kind of framing of very much focusing on local needs and communities has taken center stage. However, I do think, and some of the data from Ellen reinforces this, the fact that the construction sector is a place where this purely local approach really cannot work. Our sector is hugely reliant on a labor workforce, and particularly migrant workforce. Already across Europe, we see a labor shortage in the regions of millions, and reports like this one highlight that to have these kind of more sufficiency, circularity-led approaches, we need that workforce to drive the agenda forward. So there's an opportunity, but that opportunity must be fulfilled. And this kind of protectionism and isolationism, potential tightening of migration rules really does kind of stifle that growth, and will in the long term slow down the transition that we need to see. So I think in terms of, I guess, my reflections on the global dimension, I think there is a need to be pragmatic and to try to kind of ride the waves that are coming our way, and be clever and smart about leveraging the opportunities that we have, but also a reminder to kind of focus on the destination, and keep that clearly in mind, rather than just being opportunistic, and making sure that the focus is on the kind of long-term global outcomes that are about a kind of global transition, not just a kind of localized just transition. So yeah, I look forward to diving further into this in the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julio, for this broader perspective. And I think we're just gonna stay on without sharing the slides, because we're going into the debate now, and I think we need to create a small PowerPoint for this. So we'll stop sharing. So Julio, another debate is open, and I really hope to see some questions in the chat or the Q&A, because it is always most intriguing when you have the debate. But anyways, to get us going, thank you, Julio, for giving this overview of how drivers have really changed rapidly within the last few months. So in many ways, you could argue, as you're doing, that it will improve or the drive for circularity, although for other reasons. But how will it also affect more precisely the pros and cons for a decent job and just transition? Because you could also argue that, yes, more circularity, but we really have just to make things cheap, to make things work, and then someone doesn't care so much about labor force and so on. So how will it impact the just transition aspect, these kind of the changed environment as you talk about?
I think I think there are definitely some upsides. I think there's also definitely some downsides. And I think when we talk about the price of materials and the price of different alternatives to construction, I think I would kind of recommend that different approaches are taken depending on who you're kind of engaging and what the metrics for success are. I think for actors that are more kind of socially aligned, you can talk about the kind of inherent risk in undertaking approaches that rely on labor exploitation somewhere along the supply chain in order to keep a product cheap. For those that are less kind of ethically aligned, you can talk about the kind of risks and unpredictability of global supply chains. You know, we've seen over the past 6 or 7 years, huge disruptions to global trade that can make a product that would appear to be very, very cheap all of a sudden become very, very expensive. So I think there is definitely a need to take that into account when developing business models. I think in terms of the kind of overall kind of macro framing in terms of opportunity for decent job creations, I do think that is something that is becoming very salient in many in many narratives, particularly in governments in the global north. I think that there is very much a recognition by parties across the political spectrum that decent jobs are a key demand for many people. I think the question for me remains decent jobs for whom? And I think that's where, for me, bringing in this global perspective again, thinking about the people who may be left behind in other countries, if supply chains are kind of purely focused onto the local in the local region, I think there is a bit of a loss of this sense of a global solution to a global problem. And I think we're seeing this we've seen this in different sectors, particularly somewhere which have a kind of heavier reliance on global imports, like the garment sector, where obviously we've seen big businesses pull out of contexts which become politically fraught or challenging to operate within. And I think those are, when we're tackling global issues, I think the understandable sense of wanting to focus on local issues can be a short-term solution, but it doesn't address the kind of long-term issues that we all need to address to have a global solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so don't create solutions one way and problems another place. And still, if you have questions, please do not hold back. Ellen, a question for you, and it's building a bit on your observation, Esther, that especially if we talk about build nothing new and we have to renovate and transform or whatever you call it, we'll need a really substantial upgrade of the workforce because you have to take rather sophisticated, advanced decisions on site because every building is different, and you're not just installing prefabricated gypsum boards and so on. I think one argument against circularity could be that, but it's it requires a lot of hands and we don't have enough workforce in many places, so we will just increase labor shortage. So also for that reason, the ability to do, as you talked about in the Austrian case, Esther, actually to include more people in the job market is very important. Yeah, so to you, Ellen, but perhaps also to you, Esther, what kind of specific vocational training is needed in order for more people to be able to be part of the circular built environment?
Inderdaad, and I can respond on that, but also on what Julio said. I think we have now a large perspective, and as trade unions, we like to go bottom up. And indeed, of course, we focus on vocational education and training. And what you say, for whom? Who is involved in this vocational education and training? As I mentioned in my presentation, we have a lot of migrant workers coming to not only to Western Europe, nowadays you also come to Eastern Europe, but then from beyond the European borders. And what I did not mention in my presentation, but what we are faced with is that most of these migrant workers, they do very easy jobs, very task-oriented jobs. So we indeed need a lot of hands, workers, but we recruit them when they're needed. And yeah, to be a bit blunt, we kick them out when they are not needed. And then a new project starts, we recruit, and then we kick them out again. That is not very sustainable. It's actually a driver for labor shortages. You touched upon that, Julio, that we have labor shortages. But to simply say, and that is how we do it now. Okay, we have labor shortages. Let's go and recruit people from beyond the European Union. And we are not against migration, and not at all, because we have been working with migrant workers for so many years in the construction sector. We know what we are confronted with, but to include that specific group better into our labor markets, and to start with intra-EU labor migrants, because we have the third country nationals that are the people that coming from beyond the European borders. But why do we not include our labor markets from within our labor migrants from within the European Union better? If the construction sector talks about accessing new target groups, we are always talking about youth, that we want to incorporate them better within our markets. We talk about women because we are still very much male-dominated sector, but we have no programs whatsoever to better incorporate the current population of intra-EU labor migrants. And that is where transparency on a construction site comes in, that we do need to know who is working for who, so that we are also able to make visible what all these skills are that these people bring with us, and try to have progress to keep them on board and try to work with us. And yes, that's maybe very old-fashioned, but I try to see that we can create direct jobs and more directly employed, so that we are able to have vet and skills training, but not as something that is that we put a lot of investment in and it's gone because we have kicked them out of the sector. And we want to incorporate these people in our sector. We want to educate them, and we want to upskill them, and try in that way to face also the problem with the labor shortages. But we do need help. This is something that the sector cannot do on themselves, and that is where also the part of the government comes in, or EU policy comes in. And that is a very it's not a quick fit solution that we seek for, but at least we need to know what we want with the sector, and we need to get rid of this task-oriented sector, and we need to talk about lifelong learning and about programs where we can give persons, migrant workers, a future within the sector, and that we can embrace these people and can how do you say that in English? I do not know, but then we go upwards instead of flat line or even downwards. Yeah, but you probably know the word better than I. Yeah.
Well, in Danish I know it as well. But anyway, the point being not only to invest in education and training, but also invest in continuation and training that we actually keep. And Esther, as you were saying in the beginning, you have, I would say the luxury, but you have the really interesting property of working across industries. So construction is one of them, but not the only one. So I do wonder, do you have any insights from other industries, for instance, the textile industry, on what kind of qualifications, vocational training, upgrades, whatever, is the most important to look at in order to be ready for circularity?
Yes, I have the pleasure and often the challenge of knitting together multiple issues across multiple industries. In terms of the specific training that's required across industries, I mean, there is a huge amount of variation. And as Ellen and Julia will know, that looking even at specific occupations within the construction industry, there's quite specific training required. I think something that has been agreed quite widely around education and training agencies working on circularity, that there is a need for what they call a T-based skills approach. So there are these technical deep skills that are very specific to a particular role, a strategy, a country, a sector. But we have on this horizontal of the T, skills that are quite uniquely relevant to the circular economy, that are more about more than just communication and being able to work with multiple people at different stages of the value chain, because we're not just following a linear path anymore, we're looping back at multiple stages often, but also that understanding of what different people are doing at different stages. So for example, on-site workers trying to renovate a building don't just but they're not easily installing new building projects like they would have done before with very clear instructions for particular components. They really need to understand how this building might have been built 10, 20, 50, 100 years ago, what the role is of different suppliers, how they can then collaborate and problem solve on site, but also off site to reach solutions. I think looking at other industries, there's also some, I think, very interesting similarities, both within and outside of Europe. So I think the first, and Julia mentioned this, is the textiles industry. So in order for employers to provide jobs that are of good quality, that provide fair wages, they themselves need to have a business case that means that they can provide those opportunities and, as Alan said, provide sustained opportunities rather than one-off piecemeal approach. But we do see, as I mentioned, there are specific perceived costs and risks for circular economy business models that often stand in the way. And I think many working or with knowledge of the textiles industry will know that many textiles recyclers in Europe have gone bankrupt in the last couple of years, despite what we know is an overwhelmingly large and growing textiles mountain that's currently gathering in Europe and being shipped to other countries. So this business case needs to be strengthened, as Ellen says, by a clear policy direction, which means that people don't feel hesitant to invest in the infrastructure and the technology that's needed and the jobs that come with it. And the other interesting similarity I was reflecting on with some of Ellen's colleagues when I had the pleasure of joining the most recent expert meeting for the Sidekick project, the social ID cards, is that across every industry and country in the world, transparency and visibility into the workforce is what is needed. Because if you want to implement a change, you need to know where you're working from. We need baselines, we need proper mapping of value chains of who is involved in what processes and how things will change for them if you implement different practices. And this is something that I work on very closely in Bangladesh, for example, where there's a big agenda instigated by EU sustainability policy towards cycling back of offcuts of textiles into production of new products for the European market. And their transparency, mapping the workforce, is exactly what we're doing. And it's the same thing that we need to be doing in Europe as well.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for sharing this. We have a few minutes left, and still, if anyone have a question, please go ahead. I think, as you also laid out in the beginning, Esther, you looked into 2 of the 4 pathways in the report. From CBC. And I think it is actually quite a fundamental discussion, and perhaps also a one where we have a shifting perspective, as you talked about, Julia, that I think a few years back, I think most of us thought of circularity were something about replacing new materials with reused and recycled materials. And I think today, in many countries at least, we're looking much more into the build nothing new scenario, because we have this idea that basically we have the housing what we need, we just need to use it better, and we can't allow us the luxury of spending even more resources. So this is I think a bit of the shift that has been mainly from a sustainability point of view. But I would like to ask all 3 of you, do you have any favorite pathway, the material built with the old materials or reused materials compared to build nothing new pathway? Do you, from a worker's perspective, have any preferred pathway? I know it's a big question, but it is nonetheless a fundamental
of course
borderline right now.
Of course, you sent us a few questions on advance, so I had to give it some thought. Because, well, from the worker's perspective, when we are living in this ideal world, I would say build nothing new. And then we can focus on renovating, retrofitting. It requires technical workers. It requires a workforce that needs to be able to oversee a project. So it requires more skills than just knowledge of one single task. It encompasses many varieties. But we're not living in this ideal world. In Netherlands, we face a housing crisis. We need to build at least I cannot remember the figure, a big amount of houses. So it needs to go hand in hand. But indeed, of course, also building with the right materials requires extra skills. And I hope we use them not only to really educate the workforce, and not only to go to a task-oriented manner of working. So, but for the worker, I think renovating and that approach would be far more have a good advantage. But it is a mixture, I think.
Yeah, it is probably indeed. Julio?
I'm happy to go. I think I'm definitely a big fan of the building as little as is absolutely necessary. I'm not sure building nothing, but I think there's a lot of buildings out there that are not quite being used to the maximum of their potential. I think there are many homes that are either being kept empty or operating as second homes, many that are operating as short-term rentals, particularly in bigger cities. And I think there's a sense that for sure there is a housing crisis. I think the easiest way to make at least a dent in the housing crisis is by trying to reallocate the existing buildings that are either sitting vacant or underused. I think where there will be a need for construction, that is obviously welcome. I think we have a very limited carbon budget across Europe. And if we look at kind of the history of the world, we've used the vast majority of resources way, way more than we should have ever used. So I think it's important to be very, very careful about anything new that we build, and making sure that when we build it to the highest specification possible. But I do think that the primary approach should be really focusing on trying to make the best use, redistributing, reallocating the existing buildings that we have, making sure that they're as fit as possible, as usable as possible. And then we really look at building as the kind of last solution.
And that is also from a worker's perspective that you say this.
I think that the report is the reason I've been sharing it so widely is because that is often a fear that governments has. What does that mean for workers? And actually the report is really, really helpful in actually highlighting the upsides for workers, and in terms of the jobs that can be safeguarded, that are harder to automate, that are harder to industrialize, that require more of a niche skill set, that is harder to replace with AI, is harder to replace with kind of copy-paste jobs. It will, in the long term, ensure that those jobs are more specialist, are better paid, have better conditions. So yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have to say that also in a Danish perspective, we see it as a way to recruit future generations of craftsmen. Esther, I think we will end on you perhaps sharing your thoughts on the two scenarios, but perhaps also bring back the recommendation slide. And it's a bit challenging thing. I'm asking you to kind of conclude everything, but nonetheless.
Yeah, first bit.
Yeah, we're gonna find the right slide in a minute or second. Yeah, please, Esther.
Yeah, no rush. Yeah, well, I mean, building on Ellen's idea of the ideal world, I think actually these two strategies work together, because in an ideal world, we are indeed utilizing existing building stock to our best ability, but we're also renovating those buildings using the right materials. And I think this is also interesting potentially in terms of overcoming some of the challenges that I mentioned around scale. So reuse, very tailored approaches to buildings is, yeah, very project by project. There are issues around scale and how we can achieve large scale upskilling required. Whereas recycling and the potential to create more usable products with the right materials, there's huge potential and huge activity already happening within the sector. So we have the opportunity to scale up those activities, and with that scale the quality of those jobs, and bring that into existing retrofit and renovation projects to make them more efficient themselves and potentially strengthen their business case. And yeah, as I said, all of this then strengthens the business case for employers to improve the quality of jobs and improves the resilience of the industry overall, and the ability to engage workers on over a longer time period, as Ellen said, rather than task by task. But with 1 minute left, I will, as you asked, go back to these recommendations, and also urge you all to read the report if you have not yet, to reach out to to myself at Circular Economy, but also to the experts that contributed to the report, including Julio and Ellen, to continue this conversation. But these 3 recommendations, I think also is very pleased to have these 2 join the session today, because what we tried to also make very clear in the report is that this isn't just the role of industry, but it's really, there's an incredibly important role for social partners to work with national agencies once they've been, well, not only once, but as they're being given a clearer direction at the EU level, and to work with front-running companies that have the means, the scale, and the resources to develop some of the conditions that will allow the many SMEs that Ellen referred to also come on board with scaling these strategies. And we touched on it every now and then, but in terms of both pathways, an incredibly important point I also want to emphasize as we close is there are technical skills that are needed. There's these communication skills for that T-based skills approach, but occupational safety and health, the protection of workers on site, but also moving between multiple projects is paramount importance. There's been some early work by EU social partners on this topic, but I think there's a lot more that we can do, really diving into the particular occupational safety, health, and other skills requirements for particular circular strategies that can really support this collaboration, these tripartite agreements and corporations that are needed for the just transition.
Okay, thank you so much, Esther, for this. Time's up. Thank you all for participating today. Thank you, Esther, for your overview, Ellen, for your insights on workforce, and Julio for your contextualization into the bigger schemes of things. And perhaps borrowing a bit from you, Ellen, it would be fair to say that the workforce needs circularity, but equally that circularity needs the workforce. So thank you for being here today, and look forward to further discussions later on. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.